Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's final Water and Business Roundtable. Based on key takeaways from the Water and Finance Roundtable convened by SIWI and the Government of the Netherlands, this third and final Water and Business panel will consider the steps needed to ensure that water and finance communities join efforts for a more water-secure future. Joining me today, I'm very happy to welcome Joe Ray, Senior Advisor, Valuing Water Initiative, Government of the Netherlands, Claire Elson, Global Director, Capital Markets, CDP, and Christopher Flensburg, Head of SEB Climate and Sustainable Finance. So Joe, I'm going to come to you first. You had a roundtable with some FIs, financial institutions. And why did you want to focus on that this year? How did that conversation unfold?
Yeah, thank you, Arti. I'd like to start first by thanking SIWI for another excellent World Water Week. It's lovely to be back. It's lovely to be back in the Water and Business Programme. The Government of the Netherlands has been a long-term supporter of SIWI and of World Water Week, and in particular, we devoted additional energy to the Water and Business Programme this year. You referenced the roundtable on water and finance, and in particular the fact that we invited several financial institutions, some of whom had not actually been to World Water Week before, to participate in quite an intimate closed-door discussion earlier in the week. From our perspective, we feel that mainstream finance is an incredibly powerful lever for driving improved corporate water practices. There are many different sort of sub-levers, if you like. You can disaggregate that a lot further. It can mean engaging shareholders at board level to apply pressure to companies to drive improved corporate water stewardship practices through the business. It might mean banks providing cheaper credit to clients that are able to demonstrate good water stewardship, for example. So the basic idea is to push for the same water security outcomes that I think all of us here at World Water Week are working towards, and using mainstream finance as the entry point. So one of several takeaways from this year's discussions is that we're still very much talking different languages. So the sort of meeting of minds between bringing together some of the leading water policy and governance folk and some of our sort of counterparts in the finance space. There were a few occasions during the roundtable where I had to actually interrupt as moderator and say, can you explain that acronym to me, please? Or can you explain that bit of jargon? So I think we've made a start by opening up the dialogue between these two communities, but there's a long way to go.
And that's really interesting because we've had some water and business dialogues on center stage before this, and we've heard this, that the two sides don't speak to each other, and they need to. And Claire, you're someone who actually has one foot and has had one foot in both places. You have a long history of finance, and now working with CDP, actually working on that bridge. What is your view on the role of mainstream finance when it comes to this discussion on water security? And I understand it's your first time at the World Water Week as well.
It is indeed my first time at World Water Week, so it's fantastic to be here. And you're right, it's when I look back, I've spent over a decade in finance in what feels like a previous life. So I was an equity salesperson, so stockbroker, for over 10 years at HSBC, Merrill Lynch, and JP Morgan. So I remember very, very clearly being on the trading floor at Merrill Lynch the week that Lehman Brothers went bust during the financial crisis of 2008. So a very colourful memory for me. And yeah, I'm now at CDP. I have been for 4 years, and I now manage our capital markets team. And we engage with over 700 financial institutions globally to really drive disclosure from corporates to them so that they can then have insight and action from that program. But to answer your question, it's a fascinating thing to me. A great part of World Water Week talks a lot about WASH programs and investment in water infrastructure, which is so important. But the thing that for me is the elephant in the room is that really water security is a crisis that has been brought about by the action of almost all corporates on the face of the earth. And the most effective way that we can actually address that problem at a systemic level is through the lever of finance. And a lot of people may nod at that point and go, I actually don't know what that means. But the reality is finance provides the oxygen that enables businesses to grow. Without the oxygen of investment, of lending, of insurance, no business would ever have the opportunity to get bigger. That therefore means that there is a fantastic opportunity to work with the finance sector to share with them a goal that I think is achievable. It's ambitious, but achievable, that in future, every piece of finance should be considering water risk as a key element before a piece of finance is completed. And where possible, ideally, it should be working towards a water secure future. It could be through incentives, could be through a variety of different mechanisms, but that is achievable. And through that leverage point, we have an opportunity to create systemic change.
So Claire, I'm going to take those words, and of course now you say it with your CDP hat on. I'm going to come to Christopher, who's holding the oxygen canister, and say, you were at the round table. You've heard the words that Claire and Joe have said. What were your thoughts, and what is SEB doing to move forward in this sector?
Yeah, so the funny part is that we are not that many banks engaging. 5 years ago, almost none. 10 years ago, even fewer, right? And it is the oxygen, but water is also the oxygen. It's the oxygen for the society. The air is the oxygen for the society. And over the last 20, 30, 40 years, finance have been isolating itself from society and ensured that we keep integrity by transferring money to A and B and not really been looking into what the money was doing. That is changing, and that's a good change. So back in 2008, there was a big systemic failure. We actually didn't take our responsibility, and the whole system was shaking back to the oxygen. And ever since then, there have been an increasing demand on finance to take ownership, responsibility, and engage on a more constant basis. And that's why I was there, and I think that there's a big change underway where we in finance need to get a much better understanding of what water engineers, air engineers, what nature is about. What is nature capital about? At the end of the day, if we have no water, there's no consistency, there's no life. And that means that if we are not integrating that into our models, our investment models and our risk models, we will undermine the system. And we don't want to do that. We, like everybody else, are human beings. We want to contribute. However, we don't know the technical skills for addressing water. So being here, being a part of this, is a huge privilege. It's basically enabling me and hopefully many of my colleagues to start learning on what it takes to actually create a better water infrastructure and systemic infrastructure to address natural capital. So thanks everyone for sharing, and I'm looking very much forward for the collaboration.
So Christopher, what you're telling us is that, of course, the ability to engage in the conversation is actually equal on both sides. In order to be able to do what you do, you have to understand the technical questions on the ground. And to do that, you need to meet with the community on a regular basis to have that conversation and have answers to the questions you might have before it comes to taking decisions.
And then leading to that we can actually reallocate capital, and not only a million, not only a billion, but huge side capital to address the challenges we're having, which is required for the engineers to actually be capable of paying the bills and creating systems. When we've been looking into water, sorry for continuing, I know that we have limited time, but when looking into water, which we've been doing for the last almost 10 years, deeper and deeper, it becomes quite weird that finance is not more engaged, because it's actually a fantastic investment. It's a fantastic investment for the society, but even economically. However, the private market is not scaled. The private actors are not enabled or invited to participate. Hence, these investments are not taking place. So there's ways where we can actually improve the ability to enable projects. And then, at the same time, we need to have a dialogue to ensure integrity. Governments need to be involved. NGOs need to be involved. And we in finance then need to package that and reallocate the capital.
So Claire, now Christopher said he's also addressed that he needs to be invited. He needs to come to the table to actually have this conversation, to be able to operationalize intent. But from your perspective, what are the other kind of possible roadblocks and challenges in bringing these two sides together in the work that you're doing with the corporate sector?
Yeah, I think it's really fascinating. I think increasingly, exactly as you say, Chris, there's been an increasing awareness amongst FIs that water as a theme is important, that they're starting to hear and understand that there could be material risks to portfolios from water insecurity, whether that's a chemical company that they are funding who will see or have seen a material hit to their earnings because the levels of the Rhine are too low and they can't ship out their product, to opportunities that they know exist to provide new lines of financing to enable a water secure pathway for a company so that they can do whatever it is that they do in whatever sector that they operate in. But I think the main issue for a lot of financial institutions, they don't know where to start. I think one of the biggest challenges is, the carbon conversation has been really well entrenched. Pathways are very clear. Metrics are, dare I say it, fairly simple to grasp. When it comes to water, I think the concern from a lot of FIs is we understand it's different. It's more complex. There is no one single metric you can measure to solve the problem of managing your water issues. Pollution looks different to excessive withdrawals, for example. And these are local issues on a local basis, basin by basin. So it is more complex. So I think for a lot of FIs that I speak to, they're saying, absolutely this point about needing that technical knowledge and wanting that information exchange with the experts in the room who may feel as though they don't understand the finance conversation, but they have real value to bring on shining a light on what are the key stress factors and how to solve them. But I think also just having that opportunity to really get into the data, to see the data, to understand what tools, how to rank materiality by activity, it's all of those pieces that I think it's a capacity building challenge primarily.
Can I just
Absolutely.
build on that briefly, Claire? Because I wrote down from what you said, a lot of FIs understand that it's complex. The next step then, it seems to me, maybe a semantic question, but is understanding the complexity and actually
Totally.
getting into the data, understanding the multifaceted challenges and risks associated with water, right? And I think that's maybe where the opportunity comes in for World Water Week, for SIWI, for us as a, let's say, a water policy and governance and program community. There is so much thematic, deep and wide expertise in this community of practice here at World Water Week. I think that's something we can tap into. And actually one of my takeaways from the roundtable was there's a willingness to engage, I think, from both sides and a capacity development opportunity on both sides. From the water perspective, and I'm still very much new in this sort of finance space and trying to find my feet. I mentioned earlier that I had to interrupt to, ask for clarifications on the jargon. I think there's going to be a lot more of that, but I think we need to embrace that. But equally, I think, finance has a lot to learn about water. Water has a lot to offer the finance conversation. And for me, the fact that several FIs were willing to make the time and the energy and the investment actually to actually be here at World Water Week for the first time, I think that's quite remarkable. I think that's something that we in the water community need to think about how to capitalize on and drive this agenda forward.
And as Chris was saying, I'm actually coming right to you. So yes, absolutely good timing to put your hand up, because you were saying it's getting better. We had 5 this year, 0 to 10 years ago, and things are going to move forward. Now, SEB has been, of course, very active in the carbon space. And you've been attending this roundtable and have the intent and interest to take it forward. What would you like to see to be the next steps? And, of course, the comment you wanted to make in response to Joe.
So it's a combination of a couple of things. So you're saying data, and yes, data is a check. At the same time, data is not creating the solution. It is giving a credibility around addressing things, right? So it's a reference to why things are doing. But at the end of the day, it's the water engineers, it's the scientists that they need to engage and address that specific issue, which is right here. So if you look at situations like Cape Town or Houston or New York or Holland, 1953, it was people taking actions, and I think it's a combination of understanding what it takes for people to be enabled to, so the enabling factor which everyone is talking about, and I think that data can give that justification, can give that credential, or can give that reference, which enable people to move. But I think it's extremely important when you're looking at the data that those data is being transformed into various languages, which we talked about before. So we would have different benchmarks in NGOs and governments and in banks. And that translation to enable decisions to be taken and activation, enable activation is, I think, is one of our biggest challenges. It's nothing but work, but it is work, right? And it's coordination, and hence going back to being in the same room. So one thing is the data, which is essential, but then it's also using that data in the right way.
Yeah, completely. And if I can just come in on that, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I think last year CDP collected almost 4,000 corporate disclosures on water security, which gives a really good baseline insight into the state of play today, as well as other important aspects like risks and opportunities and future plans and targets. But you're right, that in itself does not solve the problem, but it is an essential starting point for understanding the exposure that a company has, for the company itself to take the time to understand, what am I actually looking at, what do I need to do? But then the exciting point, exactly to what you're saying, is then joining the dots of, so what does the solution look like? How can finance play a role in stepping in, providing that finance to maybe implement some of the solutions that are needed, whether it's a tech-based solution or some other infrastructure that needs to be implemented to improve efficiency, whatever it is. I think those things go really hand in glove.
I want to come back to Christopher and what you're saying, Claire, because I think it's important for everyone in the room and online to understand what Christopher's saying here, is that data is valuable, but it's how it's used to translate and package what you're looking for. And I want to push a little bit further when you say that translation is important. Can you unpack that for us a little bit so the people in the room understand, and online, of course, what you mean by that as a financier?
I can try. And I'll probably fail, but I will give it a shot anyway. But basically, in finance, we're allocating capital to efficiency, right? So we're looking for optimizing systems, and for a long time, unfortunately, we have ignored natural capital or natural values, which I think is going to be penalizing everyone now, because we suddenly realize the value of water and the value of air and so on and so forth. So they will be incalculated. That's one of the parts here. But when we're taking decisions, we need to understand the resource consequences and the economic consequences. And the better we understand them, the better we can quantify them, the better we can benchmark them, the easier we can bring discussions further in our systems. So one of the great, so I'm a pioneer in green finance. I've been in the green bond market since the beginning, and been traveling around for 15 years and meeting more than 1,500 clients in that time. And I don't think I met a single client that didn't want to engage. But they didn't really understand how. So if you go to a portfolio manager, he's not really allowed to take a political statement saying we do green or doing social. As a person, he wants to. So how do you help that person to bring that further in that organization? And there you need to understand the goal of that organization. You need to understand the benchmarking. So how is this referred to? And you will have specialists like myself and like you, where it's our job to create this kind of benchmarking. It's our job to create these kind of storylines, whatever you want to call them. And by helping us to get that data set where we can create that kind of benchmarking, we can support our clients, our stakeholders, who also want to engage in bringing that forward in the organization, and eventually get a mandate to take that engagement. So this is what it's about.
Can I just add to that? That's where the need for dialogue and exchange is so important, right? Because you can only do that if the need and the ask from the finance side is clearly articulated and is understood on the technical water side, and vice versa. And that requires a lot more, at a very practical level, sort of functional exchanges of the sort that we're having here and that we've tried to facilitate this week. But there will need to be more of that, a lot more, in order to progress this further.
But I want to put you on the spot then, Joe, because of course the Valuing Water Initiative is doing this. You've actually understood and picked up, I think Christopher made a really good point, is that everyone wants to, not everyone, but most people do. How do you make this possible?
Almost everyone.
You have to actually package it, quantify it, benchmark it. And Joe, you've seen that with the Valuing Water Initiative, has understood that need. And now you've identified this roundtable, this engagement.
Yeah, I think there's different elements to it. First and foremost, it's a communication challenge. We've talked about the language, that we're going to keep coming back to this. You have to understand one another's reference points, but in order to do that, you have to understand also one another's incentives. On the finance side, that means us in the water community understanding the much more technical financial instruments and decision-making processes, structures, incentives that actually drive financial decision-making. And the flip side of that, and maybe I can give you an example from the roundtable, there is also a lot of capacity building that needs to be done, evidently, in the finance space. And that involves, building alliances and partnerships with, Christopher and other frontrunners in that space. But also for us in the water community, reflecting on how we communicate and how we, convey our own messages. For example, during the roundtable, which took place under Chatham House rules, so we name no names, but the question was raised, would it not be possible to solve our water challenges if we created a water credits market that was similar to the carbon credits market? And the question hung in the air for a little while, and of course it needed to be clarified that, you know, a litre of water here in, let's say, an abundant watershed, where fresh water is abundant, and a litre of water in a highly stressed basin is not fungible. It's not equivalent. Whereas a gram of carbon here, a gram of carbon elsewhere is equivalent on a global scale. So it's, you know, there is a need, self-evidently, for a great deal of capacity building on both sides, and I think that requires from us in the water community to do a lot of listening, to have a lot of humility, to think carefully about the messages that we convey, and in particular maybe when it comes to water risk, understanding that actually from a financial perspective, water risk is not material in every business to the same extent. But that is, you know, something that we perhaps need to spend more time dwelling on in the water space and reflecting on the nuances and recalibrating our messages
I think
when we
Christopher
engage.
got excited about nuance.
I don't know, but I think I will argue.
Sorry?
So I'm hearing stories. I'm not a water expert, but I'm hearing stories about the change in groundwater, the humidity in ground, and the instability that create to houses. I'm hearing stories of flooding risk and changes in rain patterns and drainage systems. I'm hearing stories about lack of flow into dams. That can be quantified. That's economic data for consistency. Nobody has shown data which is actually showing the consequences and the kind of way of upgrading that to actually deal with that. So we haven't received, maybe because we haven't engaged, but we haven't received the data which actually is converted into our language. So I think by dedicating resources to do that, I think that you get much more robust systems and you get much more buy-in from the financial sector. There's one additional, so we're talking risk here in this context, and that's good. That's the core of finance in one way, but risk return is another way of doing it, and we're also looking at returns. So we of course manage in risk to secure that we save the investments, but we also look at how to enhance our investments. So I don't think that one should forget the return perspective. However, in many parts of the world, the water is a public issue, and there the private side can't make returns unless that you're a technology provider in one way or the other, right? So there might be a need without, and I'm not arguing for letting it loose, because I believe in the public ownership of the rights, but maybe you want to share the economics in one way or the other to facilitate that state pension funds or others which are not having a less aggressive financial model can come in and participate. So I think we need to work on the financing models to get more buy-in. So we looked into the water market, and it's not huge. It's fairly small actually. It's a lot of money for us, but if you look at from a global capital market perspective, it's a small market, the private market. And that means that big asset managers with $100 billion or $200 billion or $500 billion or $1 trillion of dollars under management don't really allocate resources. So by opening up more, you get more engagement, you get more resource allocated, and thereby you get more financial models. So there's a lot of things that can be worked on to improve the models.
Claire, I'm going to actually ask you a question, Claire, because of course CDP is a recipient of this information that Christopher's getting, because to benchmark, to package, to understand the intent of corporate members to actually engage, that's where CDP is kind of translating and helping translate between the willingness to engage and the ability to operationalize action and actually invest. But Christopher, you touched upon an important point about the public sector and public sector engagement and water being potentially a public good. It also brings into the conversation politics. And of course, how agnostic is this investment? Because are you then, as CDP, for example, privy to every political appetite, and you have to change according to appetites and what they're looking for? And of course, there have been some very bad political decisions in the last year, some very good ones. We have, of course, a very wary year ahead. How does CDP look at this, and what have you seen in terms of how agnostic this discussion can be? Or is it?
Yeah, well, it's fascinating because I think we have, generally speaking, reached a level of maturity amongst financial institutions that this, the need for data on environmental impacts on portfolios goes beyond politics, because it's not an agenda that should be buffeted around by whichever agenda has authority. And it's interesting, we've seen this in the last year. Obviously, a lot of challenging headlines coming out, and some interesting approaches being taken by certain members of the Republican Party in the US. But interestingly, every year CDP renews or goes out to our signatory base of over 700 financial institutions and engages them to say, look, would you like to support our program for another year? Even when we did this in the last 9 months, we saw almost zero attrition in the support that we were seeing from the US-based financial institutions. And I think the key to that is the fact that we are, through our systems, delivering. I mean, last year we had, I think it was over 15,000 corporate disclosures. It's a huge stream of data. And when it comes down to it, and I think this comes to the data point, but also to an extent the creativity point with our water disclosures, we are able to showcase facility-level data for specific high-risk water basins. So it is possible, if financial institutions are looking into these data sets, they can find real gems of information in that data, which can help for them unpack where water risk lies and really challenge companies on what they're doing about it, potentially offer finance to deliver solutions. So it's a way in which they can check against their portfolios for where the risk lies and also see the opportunity.
So data being used for transparency becomes really critical.
Correct.
And I think what we've heard today, of course, is hugely optimistic and hugely ambitious for what we can expect next year. And as you mentioned, Joe, a lot of people that you brought to the roundtable were first-time Water Week delegates. I want to ask all of you, before we end our panel, what would you like to see being discussed here next year? Chris, I'm going to start with you.
More finance people, first of all. So I think that we do have a possibility to contribute, and I think that that it will be good. I would also like to see a discussion about how to engage the private sector in public projects. I think that's required without losing the integrity and the ownership. So how can that be done? Can that be done? I think that will bring a big part forward. I would also, going back to what we talked about before in respect to the data, appreciate models which are showing the economic ecosystems of various water actions, upgrades, maintenance, coming from a finance perspective. So that would be my wish list.
So economic evidence from a finance perspective. Christopher, will you come back next year?
If I will be invited, I will come back.
Claire?
Yeah, I echo that. I think it would be fantastic to see a real boost in numbers of financial institutions, and ideally we could have some specific sessions for insurers, specifically for banks, for asset owners, to really drill down into what specific actions we can take with those to do some capacity building. And what I would love to see is some really ambitious commitments being voiced by the finance sector in terms of their commitments to ensure water security across their portfolios and to reduce their impacts on water risk. And I think that also extends to policymakers. I think we need to see much more global coordination and ambition. So I think some really ambitious targets feel like very overdue. We need to see that coming through next year.
Joe, I mean, this is...
May I just make a question? Sorry for that. When you say that, so commitments, is that governance where you're engaging, or is it capital commitments?
It should be both.
And what's the difference?
Well, governance will be relating to processes, responsibilities, accountabilities. And where capital is committed, it would be relating to literally everything from on the risk side, how those risk departments are starting to consider water risk. And we've been having some interesting conversations about stress testing, which you've been in the room for as well in part. But also in terms of targets that could be set around sustainability-linked lending for water, for example.
And I think for Joe, I mean, the Valuing Water Initiative is actually why we're having this conversation and bringing it to the attention of bringing these communities together. I think a lot of what Christopher and Claire are saying is really sitting on your table about where would you like to see this end up this time next year?
All of the above.
That was not one of the checkboxes.
More finance folk at the table, a more focused, structured discussion, further preparation, more engagement with the World Water Week participants who are maybe interested, curious about this theme, would like to know more. I think it's a huge opportunity. And I think collectively we need to be bold, we need to embrace the discomfort. And I think we can go a long way together if we do.
And ask the questions that we need to ask to actually understand how to bridge this.
Exactly.
May I just, so Joe, you represent the Dutch government, and you invited a lot of pension funds into a discussion where we are part as well. Thumbs up and thanks a lot. So you are actually speaking what you're talking about, so it's highly appreciated and great work.
Well, thank you for being here.
Ladies and gentlemen, join me in giving them a warm, warm thanks and a round of applause. More finance this time next year.